Good day everyone, I am Vanessa. I am from Group 2 and I will be tackling the first part of the Article 3, the modifier of human acts. So, the modifier of human acts, we mean the things that may affect human acts in the essential qualities of knowledge, freedom, voluntariness, and so make them less perfectly human. And so, modifier of human acts also known as the obstacles. The obstacle impacts people's understanding of and freedoms associated with their actions. So, from the word itself, modifier. So, modifier, it means nakaka-apekto or it affect people's action. And, by the way, modifier of human acts has a 5 parts. And the first one is the ignorance. So, what is ignorance? Ignorance is, ay by the way, before that, naray ko i-share nga quote nga nakita nako while nag-search sa website sa akong topic. So, naa siya diri kabutang, one cannot be excused for a reasons of innocence out of ignorance. So, what is ignorance, by the way? Ignorance refers to people's lack of knowledge. This can refers to moral or intellectual knowledge. So, there is, let's first differentiate ignorance and innocence. Ignorance is ka mangmangan or walang kaalam-alam, while innocent is innocente. A little bit tricky unsaon siya pag-understand kay same naman gud ang iyang atong understanding sa ignorante o sa innocente. And by the way, ignorance is defined as the absence of knowledge in a person who is required to know and to know what he does not know. So, I have example for this para mas dali siya masabtan. Example, like, niadto ta sa foreign country and then we don't know sa ilang mga rules dito or ilang mga law. Then, there is a time that you go through to a specific road and then na siya signboard. Pero, like, foreign country man siya, like, for example, ang nasa signboard kay Arabic language or French. So, as a Filipino, di kita kasabot kay atong laging masaton na ka English or Tagalog, like that. And then, kapakusog, like, ni go through mo na nga specific road. Dawa mo kabalo nga ang nakabutang na sa signboard is naa siya specific speed limit nga kailangan i-follow. So, muna siya ang akong pasabot sa pagiging ignorante. So, wa ta kabalo sa ilang gibutang. So, ignorante kita lang apart. So, innocence also, it means the absence of knowledge in persons who is not required to know what he does not know. So, nako example ani, then I don't know if mo fit siya sa definition sa innocent kay ang akong nakuha nga example is like right now pandemic ta and then bala naman ta natin mga health protocols na need i-follow. So ikaw nga tawo kabalo na ka nga naatay health protocols nga kailangan i-follow, ato ra gyapon siyang gilabag. So nagats ninyo ng kabalo na ta, pero ato siyang gilabag. Dili siya mabutang sa pagiging ignorante. Ang ignorante is, wala man ta kabalo nga, atong kailangan mahibalaan. Ang pagiging inosente is, ato siyang nahibalaan, pero nagpabuang-buang na jutang, wala jutang kabalo. So, muna siya akong topic sa ignorance, and napa na siya mga follow-up parts and it will be tackled by my next group mates. Thank you.
So, good morning everyone. I will be your second reporter and I am Kate Gael Canyaveral and I will be discussing to you the ignorance and its object. So, the ignorance and its object is the thing of which a person may be ignorant is a matter of law, fact, or penalty. The ignorance and its object is the first part of ignorance. So, let's start with the first matter of ignorance in its object, which is the ignorance of law. Ignorance of law is the ignorance of the existence of a duty, rule, or regulation. You may be common with this phrase, or you may be familiar with this one, that it says that ignorance of the law excuses no one. So either you have violated the law and you don't know the law that existed, still you will face the consequences, the penalties, and the charges for the violations. Okay, for example, annoying people can be charged for being merely annoying. This is the unjust vexation law in the Philippines. This will be read in Article 287 in the second paragraph, which states that any other coercion or unjust vexations shall be punished by arresto minor or a fine ranging from 5 pesos to 200 pesos or both. Both legal experts and laymen have condemned unjust vexation as an ambiguous catch-all provision with no specific meaning, merely something to charge annoying people with. So, if you'll get irritated when someone keeps pestering you every second and every minute of your day, like continuously going with you anywhere you go, then just being so noisy. Here, yourself, you love peace, you love the environment, the ambience where you can settle yourself in and just rest your mind, rest your heart, and then do nothing. But there's a friend that maybe keeps on bothering you, pestering you. I would do charge him or her for unjust vexation. But I know that it's part of a teenage life when we have friends who keeps pestering us. But with this one, it's just very off to have a law like this. But maybe it's for some people who are introverts. I don't know. That is the unjust vexation law in the Philippines for people being merely annoying to you, keeps pestering you, bothering you. So that's a big help also. And then being ignorant is it's not a sin, but I think it's better for us to research on some things that we don't know so that we can't be ignorant. We can never be ignorant at some points in our life because it's very stupid for us. Like imagine at my existence I only found out about this law just recently, just because of the topic was assigned to me. So it's a win-win situation, of course. Thank you for listening.
So this is Wendy May Cañete, and my topic is about ignorance of fact. Ignorance of fact, you are not aware of the nature or circumstances of an act as forbidden. Example of this is naay usa taga province, and sa ilang province kay pwede ra sila mulabang-labang anytime, anywhere. And then kani nga taga province kay na-apply niya ni nga mentality nga pag-agto niya sa Manila, na-apply niya ang mentality nga maglabang-labang lang miskat asa. So ang understanding niya pwede ra maglabang-labang miskat asa. So pag-abot sa taga province sa Manila, nilabang siya sa lugar nga ginabawal ang labangan. So wala siya kabalo nga ang iyang gilabangan nga lugar kay dili dapat labangan kay ipinagbabawal ang paglabang dira nga dapit. Wala siya kabalo sa nature and circumstance sa act nga iyang gibuhat nga ginabawal di ay. So karon kay nag-jaywalking man siya, nadakpan siya sa traffic enforcer. So pagdakop sa traffic enforcer, since wala man pud siya kabalo nga nariina ng abatas, gitagaan lang siya og warning. So karon after 1 week labang na pud tong taga province. Paglabang niya, wala siya lakaw nga galabang, kundi nagkamang siya. So ang pangutana, lumabag ba sa batas ang taga province? Yes or no? Syempre yes, kay nilabang man siya. Okay, karon ni ana ang traffic enforcer atong taga province, ana siya sa atong taga province nga, uy, ikaw na pud diba gitagaan naman tikaw warning and gi-explainan na tikaw nga bawal mo labang diring dapita. Anong nilabang naman pud ka? Nya gakamang pagjud. So karon ang depensa sa taga province ana siya, ay sir, abi na ko jaywalking ra nya abi na ko mag-walking ra nya gakamangmang ko naday batas nga G-crawling. So wala batas nga G-crawling syempre. So karon bright man pod ang traffic enforcer hindi pangutan natong taga-province ana siya. So nakalabang baka nga gakamangmang ka. Syempre, ang tubag, yes. So, mo na, since nakalabang man ang taga-province sa lugar nga kinabawal ang paglabang, consider Japon na siya nga jaywalking. Ang taga-province, wala siya kabalo, and dili siya aware na pag ingon ta nga jaywalking, it includes anything basta wrong ang imong passage sa ipinagbabawal na labangan, jaywalking Japon na siya. So, if vehicle na nagsakay ng labang, lain na siya violation, di na siya jaywalking. Anyway, so ignorance of the fact is the ignorance of the nature or circumstance of an act as forbidden, like what the taga-province did na jaywalking siya. The lack of knowledge that what one is actually doing comes under the prohibition of the known law. There is a prohibition of a known law, however, lack of knowledge. Kanang wala sila kabalo nga ila di ay gibuhat, ginabawal di ay like what the taga-province did, nag-crawling siya kay abi niya og jaywalking ra ang bawal. So that is included in the facts of the law. Well, in that sense, you may be excused by using the defense of good faith na you wanted to follow the law. However, your appreciation of the law might be different from what is expected. Your interpretation or understanding of the law might be misguided. However, ignorance of the fact is not necessarily an excuse for you to disobey the laws, but only under good faith. Next is ignorance of penalty. Ignorance of penalty, lack of knowledge of the precise sanction affects to the law. Example is naius ka estudyante nga nagkating classes kay tungod gusto lang niya dili mo sulod sa klase, and sa iyang huna-huna is okay lang nga magkating siya kay igo raman siya kasabaan. But in fact, the fixed penalty for this offense is 2 weeks suspension. Wala siya kabalo ug iyang pagtuo nga igo ra siyang kasabaan. But in fact, grieved ang offense. So, ang ignorance of penalty kay makamodify siya sa atong action nga ginabuhat. So, if kabalo tong student, grabe di ay ang parusa nga iyang madawat, malamang sa malamang, magduwa-duwa siya og buhat or dili niya buhaton ang butang nga makadaot niya. So the student, without knowing how grave is the penalty attached to that prohibited act, nagcutting classes siya. Kaya man siya kabalo nga 2 weeks suspension di ay ang iyang madawat. So ignorance of penalty kay kanang abi natog ang atong buhaton kaya walay parusa, or dili dako ang parusa nga atong madawat, or wala ta kabalo nga naay parusa. So sometimes some of us do bad things kay tungod abi nato walay consequences or mabarang parusa or wata kabalo nga naday parusa ang atong mga actions. So that is ignorance of penalty. Thank you.
Good day everyone, I am one of the reporter of Group 2 and I am going to discuss what is ignorance in its subjects. So let's start. In the person in whom it exists, ignorance of law, fact, or penalty is either vincible or invincible. So today we will going to talk what is vincible ignorance and invincible ignorance. So let's start with the vincible ignorance. Vincible ignorance is that ignorance that can be dispelled by the use of ordinary diligence. Vincible ignorance is inconsequence or culpable ignorance. So, vincible ignorance in Catholic theology or moral theology pa is the ignorance that a person could remove by applying reasonable diligence in the given set of circumstances. Or you can just remove this ignorance by just reasoning out or using some efforts. So in this ignorance, we will going to use the example of Saint Thomas Aquinas so that you will going to know better what this ignorance is about. So in this case, the hunter does not bother trying to find out if the object is a deer or a man, and he shoots anyway. In killing the man, the hunter's responsibility is increased because he could have put in the effort to find out if it was in the fact a deer he was shooting or not. His will was not fully informed, but he did not allow this to alter his decision. Therefore, he is more responsible for the killing. So, mauto siya ang example for the vincible ignorance, no? That's why we call it vincible ignorance, for the reason that we ought to act without thinking, without knowing, or without putting an effort to know just just how the hunter shoots the person without any hesitations when he had a chance to check if the object he's going to shoot is a deer or a person. So in that case, he exercised the so-called vincible ignorance. It is very easy to say that the ignorance is vincible because most ignorance is vincible ignorance. We ought to, or we don't know because we don't want to know. So that is the example given by Saint Thomas Aquinas for vincible ignorance. So next slide, there are the degrees of vincible ignorance. Those are the crass or supine. Second is the simply vincible. Third is the affected. So first degrees of vincible ignorance is the crass, or if it be the result of total or nearly total lack of effort to dispel it. Second is the simple vincible, or if some effort worthy the name but not persevering and wholehearted effort be unsuccessfully employed to dispel it. And last is the affected, if possible is made to retain it. So let's give again another example for you so that you can better understand what degrees of vincible is about. So our example for the vincible ignorance is there is a freshman who has been in college a month and does not know the college rules of order is in the state of vincible ignorance in the matter. So mauna siya ang atong example for vincible ignorance. So kanang degrees of vincible ignorance is katong freshman nga naa sa college a month ago and does not know the college rules of orders is using degrees of vincible of ignorance or the crass or supine if he has made no effort or scarcely any to know the rules. His ignorance is crass or supine. If he has positively avoided learning the rules so that he may have a ready excuse for faults and may be able to say when taken in violation of order, I did not know the rule, his ignorance is affected. And if he has made some inquiries about the rules or has tried once or twice without success to produce a copy of the ruled ebook, his ignorance is simply vincible. So, maura na siya guys ang example of degrees of. So, invincible ignorance is ignorance that ordinary improper diligence cannot dispel. Hence, invincible ignorance is never the fault of the person in whom it exists, and it is rightly called inculpable ignorance. So in invincible ignorance, guys, it is used in Catholic moral theology to refer to the person or the state of person who are, through no fault of their own, ignorant of the fact that the Christian message is true. It is the opposite of the term invincible ignorance. So for example, kanang mga religion or religious nga if you are encounter some of those people nga may belief when it comes to their religion, dili jud yan nimo sila ma-please no to yung paniwalaan ka, because they have their own paniniwala, and you can't you can change their mind about their beliefs. So next slide is about the degrees of invincible ignorance. So there are two, the physical invincible and the morally invincible. So physical invincible, if no human effort can dispel it, and morally invincible, if such effort as good and prudent men would expend to dispel it, taking into account the character and importance of the matter about which ignorance exists, is found to be ineffective. So to further illustrate these degrees of ignorance, I will give the example which I have taken in the book. So a man is seeking for a 17th century pamphlet to which he finds himself constantly referred in learned books on the subject of economics. After months and months of searching through libraries and following inclusive clues, the man discovered that there is only one copy of the pamphlet in existence, that this copy is in the library of a recluse who resides in a foreign country, far across the sea, and that, although one may be permitted to read it, the pamphlet may neither be borrowed nor copied. The man is in the state of invincible ignorance with regards to the contents of the pamphlets. His ignorance is not physically invincible, for he could make voyage to the land of the recluse and study the pamphlet in the letter's library. Still, his course would involve difficulties and inconvenience out of the proportion to the importance of the matter about which ignorance exists. We say, we say therefore that the man ignorance of the content of the pamphlet is morally invincible. And for the last part of my report, always remember, guys, that the difference between vincible and invincible ignorance is that invincible ignorance is doing something wrong when one could not have known better, while invincible ignorance is doing wrong when one ought to have known better. And that's all for my report. Thank you for listening, and God bless.
Good day everyone, my name is Feb and I will be reporting ignorance in its result. So ignorance in its result considered ignorance of fact, law, or penalty with reference to act performed while ignorance exists. So these are actions we've taken as a result of our ignorance or lack of awareness of a certain issue. And under ignorance in its result are antecedent ignorance, concomitant ignorance, and consequent ignorance. First, let me discuss to you about antecedent ignorance. Antecedent ignorance is that which precedes all consent of the will. This is when ignorance comes before the will can decide on the morality of an act. In here, action is done because of ignorance and through ignorance. There's an example in the book where a man wholly unaware that today is a holy day of obligation misses Mass. He would certainly not miss the Mass if he were conscious of his obligation. In this case, the person could have attended the Mass if he had known about it, but because of his ignorance, he misses it. In this situation, ignorance existed before the act is being committed, and knowledge could have changed the decision. This is a non-voluntary act because the person is unaware of the consequences and is not expected it to be. Another example is, let's say that you are cooking and you need to add a mushroom to it, but you're unaware that the mushroom is poisonous. So if the person is ignorant, then iya dyan na isagol simply because he wasn't aware that it is poisonous, that it is harmful to the person who intakes it. So our knowledge could really affect our decision kay if we are aware that the mushroom is poisonous, then did na nato siya isagol sa tong giluto. Because we know that it is harmful and we also aware of the consequences. Again, here in antecedent ignorance, ignorance existed before the act is being committed, and knowledge could have changed the person's decision. And that antecedent ignorance does not differ from invincible ignorance, where lack of knowledge, either of fact or law, for which a person is not morally responsible. They can be held accountable for their actions because they are unaware of it. That would be all for my part. Thank you very much.
Good day, so we are now on the second one of ignorance in its result. So, concomitant ignorance. So, concomitant ignorance is that ignorance which, so to speak, accompanies an act that have been performed, even if the ignorance did not exist. So, when we say about concomitant ignorance, it's a simultaneous with the act of the will, accompanies the actions in itself. An action could have been performed even if the ignorance did not exist. So, like for example, a nominal Catholic misses Mass, not aware that the day is a holiday. Yet, even he had known, he would have missed Mass. So, his act of missing Mass does not came from ignorance, but happens in company with his ignorance, and we call that ignorance concomitant. An act that done in concomitant ignorance is not voluntary. So we are now in the last one, which is consequent ignorance. So consequent ignorance is that which follows upon an act of the will. The will may directly affect it or suspend neglect to dispel it. Thus, consequent ignorance does not differ from invincible ignorance. So when we say about consequent ignorance, it's after the act of the will. So consequent ignorance follows the consent of the will. It follows upon consent of the will. It's damage of the will, so the will may directly affect it, so it became affected ignorance or crushly neglect to dispel it, and it became cross ignorance. So, like for example, a careless Catholic suspect that the day is a holiday but deliberately refrain from making sure and does not attend Mass. If he possibly avoids knowledge in that matter, his ignorance is indirect will, so it's affected. And if he failed to acquire knowledge through sheer carelessness, his ignorance is indirectly willed, so it's cross or suspine.
Good day everyone, I am Christine May Arforsuelo. So I am going to report the ignorance scheme, the ethical principle, the first principle, and the second principle. Here you can see the classification of ignorance scheme. So I think all of you were already familiar with these phrases or words because it is already reported during the previous reporter. So as what you can see, mas dali na to masabtan on what is ignorance composed of. So we have ignorance. So ignorance is, it's either in its object, which is composed of ignorance of law, ignorance of fact, and ignorance of penalty. Another one is the ignorance of its subject, which is composed of invincible ignorance, or simply vincible, so crass of supine affected. And the other way around is the invincible ignorance, an inevitable absence of knowledge, or unavoidable. It can be morally or physically. So, the other one is ignorance in its result, which is composed of antecedent, concomitant, consequent, which is either directly willed or indirectly willed. Ethical principles are part of a normative theory that justifies or defends moral rules and moral judgments. So, or in Bisaya, bahin ni siya sa usa ka normatibo nga teorya nga nagkamatarong or nagdepensa sa moral nga mga rules or moral nga paghukom. And also ethical principle which emerge from our study of ignorance as a modifier, or it gives information about the human acts. So we have here the first principle. So invincible ignorance destroys the voluntariness of an act, or in Bisaya ang dili mabuntog or overcome or inevitable absence of knowledge makaguba sa pagka-voluntaryo sa usa ka buhat. So let's take deeper to this principle and define what is invincible ignorance. So invincible ignorance is an inevitable absence of knowledge or unavoidable. Or in our simple dialect, say invincible ignorance usa ka dili malikayan nga pagkawala sa kahibalo or knowledge. So another definition from the previous reporter, that invincible ignorance is ignorance that ordinary and proper diligence cannot dispel, or pagka-ignorante nga ang ordinaryo or husto nga kakugi dili mawala niini. So, and this has causes. So, it's either the person is walay alam or hibalo, or wala gawon ang huna kung unsa ang iyang kakulang sa hibalo, or ang usa ka tawo man gani nakanahuna isa iyang pagkawalay alam apan nakabalo siya nga dili epektibo ang iyang kakugi or diligence para pawala niini. This kind of ignorance is unavoidable or uncontrollable to human. So no human effort can dispel it. An ignorance that cannot be overcome by using one reasons. And also we have voluntariness. So voluntariness, it depends upon knowledge and freedom. So if a certain act lacks of knowledge and freedom, we cannot call it voluntariness. So freedom depends knowledge, and voluntariness is impossible without knowledge. If knowledge is impaired, voluntariness is also impaired. Voluntariness depends upon knowledge and is impossible without knowledge. Invincible ignorance is never the fault of the person or the agent. An act in so far proceeds from invincible ignorance. It lacks knowledge, which is voluntariness, depends on knowledge. So if the knowledge is impaired, or absent, the voluntariness is also destroyed, or this act is not a human act and not imputable, or we cannot lay or put the responsibility or blame to the agent. So, para mas masabtan ang first principle on how invincible ignorance destroys the voluntariness of an act, so here we have an example. So, a good Catholic wholly inadvertent to the fact that the day is Friday, it's meat. So, or in simply Bisaya, usa ka buutan nga Katoliko, hingpit nga wala tuyo ang adlaw mao ang Biyernes. So, siya mukaon og karne. So, in this case, the agent, as he eats the meat, it may be voluntary and free. But insofar the act is an act of the violation of the law of abstinence. When we say law of abstinence, it in Catholic, it pervades the eating of flesh meat or anything that is made up of meat every Friday. So this act comes from invincible ignorance and therefore not a human act for which the agent is responsible. So, in that situation, as what I have, in my example, so, the good Catholic is wholly inadvertent. So, fully jud siya nga, wala siya kabalo. Or like, wala sayang bungog ng adlaw day Friday. So, he eats meat. So, in the act, as he violates the law of abstinence, so, it is not voluntary to him or to her because at the first place, he has invincible ignorance, which is inevitable absence of knowledge or unavoidable to him or to her, so he cannot dispel it. In my given example, in that situation, the God Catholic is wholly inadvertent to commit such violation of the act or the law of abstinence. So, he is not or she is not voluntary to the act because at the first place he lacks knowledge. So if an agent or a person lacks knowledge, so we cannot call it voluntary to him or to her. So another example is a Catholic child uses very evil language, totally unaware that such language is sinful. Or in our simple dialect, usa ka bata nga Katoliko nagamit og dautan nga sinultian, wala joy naibalan nga ang ingon ana nga sinultian makasasala. So this incident comes from invincible ignorance. As what we can see, the agent is totally unaware. So he has his inevitable absence of knowledge. So he cannot dispel it. So it also lacks voluntariness because at the first place it is invincible ignorance. So knowledge is already impaired or absent. So it is also knowledge is also impaired or absent for the child to commit such sin. So this is not imputable, or we cannot put the blame or the responsibility to the agent to commit such sin. So here we have the second principle. So vincible ignorance does not destroy the voluntariness of an act. So vincible ignorance is not an inevitable absence of knowledge. So opposite ni siya sa invincible ignorance, which is inevitable absence of knowledge. Si vincible is not. So mali yan ang pagkawala sa kaibalo, or concurrable ignorance or avoidable ignorance. So ignorance that can or should be supplanted by knowledge in Bisaya usa ka tagawalay alam or hibalo nga mahimo ora sa agent og kinahanglan nga pulihan ni agent og kahibalo. So ignorance that can be dispelled by the use of ordinary diligence. Ang pagkawali ala nga mahimong mawagtang pinaagi sa paggamit sa ordinaryo nga kakugi. So opposite ni siya sa invincible ignorance, which is no human effort can dispel it. Kaning si vincible is madispel lang ni siya og ordinary diligence. So, on contrary, it supposes knowledge in the agent of his own lack of knowledge and of his duty of dispelling ignorance. So, kini nagtuo nga kahibalo sa tao or sa agent sa iyang kaugalingon nga kakulang sa kahibalo ug sa iyang katungod sa pagwagtang sa maong pagkaignorante. So, aware na si agent that he lacks knowledge on that specific act, and also aware po siya that he has and he can or he has his duty to dispel it. So, kaya niya nga pawala sa maong pagkaignorante. So, concurable niya. The agent has knowledge which he bears indirectly upon the act which he performs in ignorance. So, the agent already has his knowledge. So, dili direkta nga iyang gidala kana nga knowledge sa iyang buhat or act nga gihimo. So, the act is indirect voluntariness. So, he knows he has his knowledge but he chooses to ignore it, or he wills to keep it. So, this is a human act and we can put the responsibility to the agent, or it is imputable to the agent. Vincible ignorance is avoidable absence of knowledge. The agent is already aware to his own lack of knowledge, but he chooses to ignore it, so he wills to keep it. So, we have here an example. So, a careless Catholic suspects that the day is Friday, but fails through sheer negligence to make certain and he eats meat. So, usa ka walay pagtagad nga Katoliko, nagduda nga ang adlaw mao ang Biyernes, apan napakyas, tungod sa bugos nga pagpabaya sa pagsiguro, siya mukanog karne. Now, while the agent does lack knowledge that the day is Friday, so he has knowledge of his own ignorant state of mind and his obligation to acquire knowledge. So, in our simple dialect, para mas masabtan, so, karon samtang ang tao kulang sa kahibalo nga ang adlaw mao ang Biyernes, siya adunay kahibalo sa iyang kaugalingon nga ignorante nga kahimtang sa una-una ug sa iyang obligasyon sa pag-angkon sa kahibalo. Og kay siya napakyas man or failed sa paghimo sa hustong kakugi o hustong pagpaningkamot para pagwagtang sa iyang ignorance, so he wills or buot niya nga i-keep na lang ang maong ignorance. So this ignorance in some cases the cause of his violation of the law of abstinence. So he wills this violation in cause. So his act has indirect voluntariness. He knows, pero he wills or he chooses to ignore it. So it is a human act and for which he is responsible or imputable to him. So in my given example, the agent already suspects that the day is Friday.
Good day everyone, I am Adele Fagador and I will be reporting the third and fourth principle. So the third principle is the vincible ignorance lessens the voluntariness of an act. So the vincible ignorance does not destroy the voluntariness of an act, it lessens the voluntariness, makes the act less human, and diminishes the responsibility of the agent. So the voluntariness is still there, but it does not possess a perfect and direct voluntariness. So the absence of knowledge of the act is done in ignorance. Ignorance can be overcome or correct, but for some reason, the agent or person didn't effort to overcome ignorance that makes the voluntariness lessens or impaired. So for example, si Juan ang gabantay sa store and he made up the prices instead of asking his parents. So there is a voluntariness in Juan's act when Juan made up the prices, but lessens the voluntariness of the agent because he doesn't know the prices. So there is an absence of knowledge that lessens the voluntariness. So the fourth principle is affected ignorance. In one way lessens and in another way increase voluntariness. So affected ignorance is that vincible ignorance which is directly willed and positively fostered. It also serves as an excuse for sins against a law. So it is when doing act on purpose or tinuyuan na act. So the agent or person doesn't acknowledge his or her mistakes and the act might hurt or cause suffering to others. So the bad act it implies, the voluntariness lessens because the agent or person lacks a perfect and direct knowledge. So for example, Juan park in the area where dili paparkingan because it might cause traffic or accident. But still, Juan chooses to park in the area. So when confront, the agent says he doesn't know nga dili pwede paparkingan dito na area. So the voluntariness increase when the agent still park in the area where it is not allowed. So the agent show the strength of the will's determination to magpumilit in such scene where the agent park in a non-parking area. So the agent person keep himself to be ignorant in order to plead innocent of charge. So the affected ignorance being consciously fostered serve as an excuse of the sin against a law.
So the next one is concupiscence. So the term concupiscence is usually used to signify the frailty or proneness in human nature upon original sin. In theology, it is a proneness of sin in man's nature due to the fall of Adam and Eve. But here in ethics, it is the bodily appetites or tendencies or simply passions. So what are passions? Passions are movement or feeling of the sensitive appetite. This lead us to act or not to act when experiencing a perceived good or evil. So passion can be neither good or evil. They became good or evil as they lead the reason and the will to make a choice. So the bodily appetites or passions are namely love and hatred, joy and grief, desire and aversion or horror, hope and despair, courage or daring and fear, and lastly anger. So these passions are called antecedent when they spring into actions and stimulated by any act of the will, that is when they arise antecedently to the will act. So let's proceed to the two types of concupiscence, which are antecedent and consequent. Antecedent concupiscence, when passion, act of men spring into action, therefore they without any stimulation are moral or influenced by the will, while consequent acts directly or the will approves directly or indirectly. So therefore the agent is responsible for them. So if we compare the two, antecedent concupiscence usually usually occurs spontaneously without having to stimulate it, while consequent concupiscence arises at the command or contributes having the consent of the individual. Now I will enumerate the examples of antecedent concupiscence or passions. So, first is the feeling of joy that arises upon the suddenly revealed view of a splendid landscape. Or it could be the anger that surges the resentment of unjust and offensive treatment. Or it could be the first feeling of attractiveness of a suddenly presented fancy or thought. It could be good or evil. It could be leaping desire for revenge for an unexpected act of cruelty. Or the first feeling of hatred that comes with the thought or sight of bitter enemy. It could be the shrinking in aversion from an unpleasant task or the urge to give up in despair in the face of crowd difficulties. So, the examples earlier that I've stated are antecedent concupiscence, but it is possible that these antecedent concupiscence could be consequent concupiscence when and only when they receive the approval of the rational will. So thus, the passion of anger that arises antecedently when one is insulted can become consequent when the feelings became deliberately retained, or the first movement of pleasure, like love and joy, is an unwholesome thought or fancy, can be or it is possible to become consequent when the will consent to retain the thought or fancy.
So good morning everyone, especially to our instructors. Sir, good morning. I am Janisel Javier, and my task is to tackle about the ethical principles that falls in concupiscence. So what is concupiscence? Concupiscence is a strong desire or bodily appetites or tendencies which are called passion. For example, joy, hatred, love, and others. So this basically means that concupiscence is a desire, our bodily appetites on how we react of that situation or what we feel inside. Our reaction. So it is basically means our reaction or what we feel. And then there are 3 ethical principles that falls in concupiscence. So first is antecedent concupiscence lessens the voluntariness of an act. The second one, antecedent concupiscence does not destroy the voluntariness of an act. And the third one, consequent concupiscence, however great, does not lessen the voluntariness of an act. So first, let's discuss the first ethical principles, which is antecedent concupiscence lessens the voluntariness of an act. So when we say antecedent, it is an action and stimulated by any act of the will that when arise antecedently to the will act. So this basically means that antecedent is the previous happenings or the earlier happenings. And then concupiscence, as what I've said earlier, it is a strong desire or bodily appetites. And then voluntariness. So when we say voluntariness, it is to mean will force, vehemence, or intensity of will act. So this basically means that our will to do something, our willingness. Yeah, it's our willingness. So voluntariness, it also depends upon our knowledge and freedom. So what we say antecedent concupiscence, what is this all about? So antecedent concupiscence is a strong desire and sudden urge to action, and thus it lessens the full prompt control which the will must exercise in every perfectly voluntary act. Hence, it impairs freedom. So, for example, our sudden feeling of joy, our hatred, pity, grief, anger, and others. So, this is our earlier reaction, which is our sudden feeling of what we feel inside, or what our reaction on that something or that situation. For example, when we heard a news or something, when we read a news, we create a sudden reaction, which is that how our senses see or what that objects presented. So we create a sudden reaction. So antecedent concupiscence lessens the voluntariness of an act. What this basically means. So I have here a situation that I created based on what I understand in this principle, which is antecedent concupiscence lessens the voluntariness of an act. So Terry and Jenny is a friend, but suddenly Terry is so angry with his friend Jenny. I don't know what's the reason, but she is angry. And because she was just carried away by her emotions, she was unintentionally hurt his friend, which is Jenny. But after that incident, she said sorry to his friend Jenny. And at the same time, Jenny, his friend, understood why he feels that way, and she forgave her. So, based on that situation, we knew that Terry was aware and responsible for her actions. And acknowledging what she has done is a form of a non-voluntary. It is an act of man. Because she has no knowledge, or it is involuntary nga no to nabuhat niya to. That's because she was just carried away by her emotions because of her angriness. Nabuhat niya to. So, therefore, we could say that this ethical principles, antecedent concupiscence, lessens the voluntariness of an act because in the situation, Terry's action lessens the voluntariness of an act because she was just carried away by her emotions, and in the end she did apologize. So noted that antecedent concupiscence is an act of man, not a human act. So therefore, nabuhat to niya nga heart iyat friend because he was just carried away by emotions. It is not his voluntary nga iya to buhaton, but because of his angriness, na-carry just yung emotions, that's why nahimo to niya. So it lessens the voluntariness of an act because of man niya gituyo nga iya to buhaton, na carried aware siya sa emotions. That's why it lessens the voluntariness of an act. So that's all about the first ethical principle, and the second and the third ethical principle will be discussed by the next reporter. Thank you.
Good day everyone, I am Lucy Amkitay and I'm going to discuss the second and the third ethical principles. So the second principle is that antecedent concupiscence does not destroy the voluntariness of an act. Although knowledge and freedom are lessened by antecedent concupiscence, they are not destroyed, and the agent's responsibility, while diminished, is not cancelled. So, in other words, it does not always destroy the voluntariness of an act, but it diminishes the responsibility of the resulting act. Example of this is that you saw your boyfriend having an affair with someone, and because of jealousy and anger, you've done something wrong to your boyfriend. Like for example, imo siyang nasumbag, or imo siyang nasampalong in public, something like that. And At that very moment, it is called the antecedent concupiscence because you've done something wrong because of your emotions, and your actions are driven because of jealousy and anger that you have because of what you saw. So, in this principle, it is still voluntarily, but it diminishes the responsibility of an act because you acted because of your emotions and anger. The third principle is consequent concupiscence. Consequent concupiscence, however great, does not lessen the voluntariness of an act. So, in consequent concupiscence, it is willed, directly or indirectly. Hence, the acts that are proceed from it have proper voluntariness, direct and indirect. So, in consequent concupiscence, the anger is already willed, and the act of violence is willed because in cause of anger, and it itself is a moment of attack. So, in antecedent concupiscence, you've done things because of your emotions. This time around, in consequent concupiscence, the actions or the anger is already willed, or you already have the consent to do the action. So, in my previous example, that you saw that your boyfriend has an affair, so this time around is gaplano na ka nga i-separate sila or bulagon sila. Probably you will done things like imong daoton ang girl or imong daoton ang boy just to separate them. So in that moment of action, the action is already planned or you have the will to do the things. So here, according to this principle, it do not destroy the voluntariness of an act, but it increases the responsibility.
Hi, good day everyone. My name is Roslyn Anduin and I will be reporting in the third modifiers of human act, which is fear. So according to the book, fear is one of the passion included under the general denotation of the word concupiscence. But it usually gives a special mention in ethics. Why is that? Because we all know that fear is a very common passion, and we should know in details its relation to the morality of acts, and moreover, it has the characteristic distinctive among the passion, and usually when it comes or when it is usually the cause of an act again when it is the cause of an act, so meaning it induced the will to do of what would not to do otherwise. So pasabot ana gibuhat nimo sa kabutang nga di angay unta nimo buhaton. So moving on to the definition of fear. So fear is the shrinking back of mind from danger. So it is the worrying to our mind from slight disturbances to the actual panic. So, and moreover, acts can be either be done from fear and with fear. So from fear, when the action are caused by fear. For example, the student cheat because he's afraid of failing. So that's from fear, example of from fear. Then be followed by with fear. So when fear is accompanying circumstances of doing the act. So example, student cheating is afraid of being caught. That's one example of with fear. So that's all.
Ethical principle of fear. So, an act done from fear, however great, is simply voluntary, although it is regularly also conditionally involuntary. So, an act done with fear is always voluntary, and one is still responsible or held accountable for that action. For example, even if you have the fear of failing the exam as a student, but still you choose to take that exam, is exactly voluntary action done by you. and you are still responsible for whatever result you're gonna have because you choose to take that exam even if you are afraid of having that lower scores or to fail that exam. Next is fear does not excuse evil act which springs from it. The law of church and the state provides that an act done from grave fear and justly suffered and excited directly in order to force the agent to perform an act that is against his will is an invalid act or one that may be invalidated. So, an act done with intense fear is always involuntary. It means involuntary, you are not accountable. You are not responsible for your action because you are doing it because there is a certain danger or harm towards yourself, or it means you didn't will it. You are forced to do it because of that impending danger, because of that impending harm towards yourself. So, for example, the professor is threatened or blackmailed by his student because the student doesn't pass the exam. The student came to act wherein he uses the weakness of his teacher to raise or cheat his grades. So in this case, the professor doesn't have the freedom to choose. So it does not apply in the elements of human act. So the professor cannot act according to his knowledge, according to his freedom, and according to his voluntariness. So it does not cancel out the voluntariness of the agent, and therefore responsibility of the agent is still present. So sometimes out of fear of a certain thing that is imposed upon us, we are somehow forced to do such things. However, there are laws between the church, both in the church and in the states, that invalidate such acts, especially when the fear we suffer is coming from an evil that is unjustly imposed upon us. However, for most of acts done from fear, they are still voluntary, wherein the agent has still the responsibility for his actions. That's all.
Good day, everyone. I'm Janice Hernando Torres, and I will continue the report to the next modifier of human act, which is violence. So, what is violence and why it is considered as a modifier of the human act? So, violence is an external force applied by a free cause, example, by a cause with free will by man, for the purpose of compelling a person to perform an act which is against his will. So, let's take for example, a person who robs a department store, and he's trying to force the cashier to give all the money in the cash box by threatening her with a gun pointed on her head, that if she will not give all the money in the cash box, he might kill all the people inside the department store or might pull the trigger and kill the cashier. So the robber is using violence, according to his own free will lang, in order to compel or force a person mo buhat sa kabutang nga dili base sa iyang kaugalingong pagbuot. So the cashier is forced to do something na against sa iyahang goodwill. We have two types of violence, the perfect violence and the imperfect violence. Under perfect violence are physically perfect violence and morally perfect violence. So let's start with the physically perfect violence. So in which all possible forms of resistance are utilized. So let's say, for example, if a woman walking along a dark street at night is attacked, and she attempts to fight off the attackers with all physical powers at her command, she has been the victim of physically perfect violence. Kaya all possible resisting are utilized. So yun, what ang tanan na iyang makaya to resist the attacker from doing something against her. Another example, unknowingly someone points a knife near your stomach while you are sitting in a waiting shed, and as a response to the threat,
sa imong life, no? You did try to fight with the stranger physically. Imo bang gikaptan iyang kamot which hold sa knife and then imo bang twist para ma-avoid nimo na nasaksak ka niya or anything na ni-fight ka physically niya with all force para dili ma-pursue or madu ang threat nimo. You are a victim of physically perfect violence. So, next is morally perfect violence, is that in which all powers of resistance should be used but not employed for a good reason. So, example, a man being robbed attempts to fight the robber, but soon realizes that further assistance will probably result in his death. So, basically, naa siya chance to protect his life and secure his safety, no? But he never did anything kay iyang gihuna-huna ang future result if ever he will fight back against the robber. Mas hindi mamatay siya, or like, i-consider niya ang mga possible na mahitabo, or if he will do something, mao ba ito'y sakto na buhaton, or is it good or bad action or response back. And perag makaingon siya na useless if musukol siya kay basi di siya pa siya kadog over the robber. So dili na lang siya mag-try og sukol. That is an example of a morally perfect violence. So the next one is imperfect violence. Is that in which some resistance is shown but not as much as it should be. So for example, an office girl worker who is working overtime in an almost empty building is approached by the department head. Ang department head is nanas iyang utak na mga lustful intentions, no? Make certain rough and violent advances against the girl office worker. So the young woman, for a moment, na siya, I will resist this action. But then, after putting some resistance, na-feel niya additional resistance might terminate the incident. So however, she quickly seizes the resistance and gives in to the man. So the office worker is the victim of imperfect violence. Okay, actually, she has the chance to stay away or do something para mapalayo or mo-stop ang laki sa iyang gibuhat. But she hesitated kay perag nahan siguro siya sa gibuhat or what. Pwede na siya mo-give her of excuses para makagawa sa building since nakasense na siya nga na something different sa giak sa ilang department head. But nausog yung una. And ni-give in na nuan siya. Dapat na siya buhaton para ma-stop ang violence. But then she hesitated and chooses to give in. So, it is an example of an imperfect violence. So here, regarding the perfect and imperfect violence, the moral principle is this, that which is done from perfect violence is entirely involuntary. And so in such cases, there is no moral responsibility. If an individual is a victim in the absolute sense of the word, no sensible person condemns him. If the victim makes a judgment that resistance is utterly useless, he need not resist. So there is no obligation to do what is useless. So that which is done for the influence of imperfect violence is less voluntary. And so the moral responsibility is lessened but not taken away completely. So the principle of violence. Acts elicited by the will are not subject to violence. External acts caused by violence to which due resistance is offered are in no wise imputable to the agent. So therefore, elicited acts are those done by the will alone or acts without a sense of moral responsibility are not subject to violence and are therefore considered voluntary. On the other hand, external actions or commanded actions performed by a person subjected to violence to which reasonable resistance has been offered are considered involuntary and are not accountable. That's all. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Kyla Jean Villosa Torco, and I will end our report with the topic habit. By habit, ethics understands operative habit, which means intellect and will, is a lasting readiness and facility born of frequently repeated acts for acting in a certain manner. So habit is permanent or had a permanent inclination to act in a certain way. So it has a lasting readiness and facility born of frequently repeated acts. And it acquires a role of second nature, which is moves a person to perform certain acts with relative ease. So what are those certain acts? So for example, smoking, drinking alcohol, biting of nails, pinching of nose, drinking water, sleeping, eat earlier, and saying bad words. So the examples of habit there is in the next slide. So for smoking, now there are certain people who are really fond of smoking, which made them a habit to smoke every day, every hour, every second, or they can even. Okay, so there are certain people really love to smoke, and smoking is represents their habit. You know, they cannot stand all day without smoking, without puffing a single cigarette in between their two fingers, and you know they have this certain habit that they cannot stand a chance not smoking, just not puffing a single cigarette in the whole entire day. Drinking alcohol, those persons are very alcoholic, has a very high dosage of alcohol. Like they can stand drinking alcohol all day, afternoon, morning, evening, and they suit this and they represent this as their habit. Biting of nails. So me, I have these two kinds of habit: the biting of nails and the pinching of nose. You know, in whenever I have a free time, like I was scrolling in the internet, streaming on my phone, watching videos and other movies. When I was pleased by it. It gives me satisfactory when I bite my nails, when I pinch my nose, you know, and literally it's it's an act that I do repeatedly. And it's very voluntarily. I do it myself. No one controls me. And it is my willingness to do it. So that is a complete example of a habit when you do it voluntarily and it's your willingness to do that certain act. Sleeping. You know, in sleeping, some people is very not really want to socialize to other people. Like they always stay in their house. They slept for many hours. There are people that their hobby is just want to sleep all day, even if um like I don't know. I don't know, but I have just witnessed that other people wants really to sleep all day, and they get sleepy easily. So they suit this a habit to sleep all day, and not a single day they cannot sleep with hours and hours of sleep. Eat earlier. Mostly me and my family ate dinner 7 to 8 p.m. just between those hours. But others have this habit eating earlier, eat their dinner earlier, I think 5 or 6 p.m. So kanang mga 5 or 6 p.m. nung snack pa mi ana. Dili mi mag-snack og alas 3, mga alas 5 nag-snack pa mi. So we were having our snacks at 5 p.m. Then mostly we will have our dinner of 6 to 8 p.m. just between those hours. And people tend this as their habit to eat earlier. Kay mostly mga tigulang sayo mong yun kay na sila mga on, kay sayo po sila mga tulog, and sayo po na silang mangmata. And the last one is saying bad words. So I have witnessed a lot of person of my age that is really fond of saying bad words and use this as an impression. They are not really taking it seriously, like, sa pisti, yawa, just like a normal chit chat with your amigos. Nowadays didn't take this kind of habit, saying bad words, seriously. Instead of making this as a very bad habit, they make it as a good expressions, especially when they are chit chatting with their amigos and amigas. Cannot they cannot control saying these kinds of words like pistiyawa, saying bad words all the time, and that is a very, very bad habit. So the ethical principle of habit in the next slide: habit does not destroy voluntariness, and acts from habit are always voluntary, at least in cause, as long as the habit is allowed to endure. So, basically, habit is an act that people or a person is voluntarily doing that certain action. So, no one is forcing you to do it. That's the clarification. It is you who is willing to do that kind of act, and not just doing it one and not just doing it in a single time, but you're repeating it. So once you are repeating that kind of act, and then it's your voluntariness and willingness to do that, then that is habit.